Emancipate yourself from mental slavery.
None but ourselves can free our minds.
Okay, so here is Land of the Giants. We're going to talk about Stephen King. Um, we both like Stephen King a lot, right?
Yes, I am much later to the party, but once I discovered him properly, I am a huge fan.
Okay, well, not later than most people, but not later than me, because I also only started reading him, recently. Um, because this is kind of the thing about Stephen King is that uh like the book sounds so silly. Like if you talk about what is the what is it about, it always sounds ridiculous. And I remember like my dad would read Stephen King when I was little and he would tell me about it and he would be like it's an evil clown. Be- I would think like that just sounds like the silliest thing I've ever heard.
No, I mean I totally agree. I'm the first one to put my hand up and say that I had a completely wrong prejudices about the quality of him as a writer. Because if you heard Stephen King, you wouldn't put him up there with the great American authors. And then, of course, the kind of yeah, ridiculous, low culture, pop culture nature of the books. I encountered obviously some of the films before I ever even laid hands on the books. And then I think also the genre itself, horror itself, struggles and has probably even since Frankenstein to have itself taken seriously. So I'm with you on the multiple layers that can stop somebody of, say, serious mind or someone who's interested in literature, capital L, from finding their way to Stephen King.
But after I tried reading Stephen King, now I kind of think of him as being kind of like the modern day Charles Dickens. Because when Charles Dickens was writing the classics, that meant like Homer and Virgil and Ovid, and Dickens was like the popular author. And to me,
Right.
that's what Stephen King is like. And if you start to read his books, what you realize is that the ridiculous idea is almost like like a trick, like it's a lure, like it's sort of like it's almost like someone would start reading the book kind of taken off guard. You know what I mean? Like,
Right. I mean, that's an interesting idea that you've got writers who are writing for mass audiences that are using narrative plots as a way of getting people into what then end up being really complicated or sophisticated meditations on all kinds of much deeper stuff. And I did also want to throw out that I think in that regard that Dickens and Twain go hand in hand. And so um, I think some of the stuff that King does with his language, as well as his kind of everyman characters, is for sure coming also from an American tradition that Twain is a reasonable example as well. Because to me, always the idea of like some boy and his friend on a raft in a river seemed like a ridiculous exercise to me. Um, you know, so I'm with you on I think you had used earlier when we were talking in private the word deceptive, and I think that's a really good word to use with King. Maybe you want to talk about that a bit more.
sure. Well, well, I looked him up a little bit on Wikipedia, and there was a thing I read where he was talking about how he came up with The Shining, and it was like it sounded so dumb. Like I was at this hotel, and I was thinking, what if it was an evil hotel? It's like so like you could do that with anything. Like what if this was an evil coffee cup? Like and actually there's a Family Guy episode where they have Stephen King on and he's like my next book is about a lamp monster.
Right, totally, totally. But I mean, I think that I totally think that that's one of the things that's like so brilliant about his works is that he problematizes like ordinary situations and ordinary objects. I mean, topiary is never going to be the same again, right? So,
Right.
right, it is a remarkable talent that he has, and I think in some ways you're absolutely correct to bring Dickens to mind because I think Dickens does the same thing. I mean, some of the descriptions of the interiors of houses, leave, I don't know, I can't think of stacks of books without thinking of Cobwebs and Haversham, right? It's the same kind of trick. I think the other thing about King and The Shining in particular is that he is willing to address topics that are very taboo within our culture. So the idea that your family can make you want to kill it,
Exactly.
it's
That's
pretty
see
taboo, right?
right. So the silly idea on the cover is it is a lure. It is a way to get you in the book, and then what he really makes you think about is something else entirely. Something something that you're not supposed to talk about, or something that you don't want to think about. So to me, well, I also want to make a comparison between Stephen King and H.P. Lovecraft, but I think Stephen King kind of does everything Lovecraft does, but even better, because Lovecraft has these kind of like vague monsters like Cthulhu that's like part dragon and part octopus and part something else, whatever. But Stephen King just has like outright random hallucinations as the monster, and there is like no description of what it actually is, and no explanation of anything, and see you never really see anything, and that's kind of what makes the goofy idea scary, is
No,
that
I think.
it's
Go
a
ahead.
hallucination. Okay, it is not the monster. The monster is just something. you know
No, I mean, I think that's a really great insight. And if we think about hallucinations, right, they originate within the mind of the person who's having the hallucination. And so I think one of the things that King is doing so successfully is always suggesting that the monsters are in some way internal, and that they are, as you say, linked to external forces that are not um, fleshed out in a Lovecraft kind of cartoon manner, right? When the monster is so clearly alien, but also so clearly described, less frightening, so much more clearly external, not problematic in terms of raising questions along the lines of, are you yourself creating your own monsters? And are your own monsters tapping into forces that are not only outside you, but in you and run through you? So whatever kind of symbols or myth narratives that King kind of starts to get at, he is always marching off down what is effectively a kind of spiritualized way of understanding the world, and that's where he puts his characters.
Sure. And well, Lovecraft often kind of uh, blurs the line between hallucination and reality in his stories, but Stephen King is so adept at it. He makes it part of the show. So, like when the character starts to hallucinate, you don't really know where that began, because it could have started with just normal things, and of course there is an unclear line between uh, Jack Torrance's alcoholism and the hotel monster, and this is kind of how Stephen King he draws you in to identifying with the character, because you know the well so I met somebody at a bookstore recently, and she said it was horrifying to be put in the mind of this abusive father, but and that kind of struck me, because to me that really kind of trivializes the character of Jack Torrance, because he's got very strong good and bad qualities, because he is, well, you can tell us about him.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's also a really good point. Is that if a reader characterizes him, Jack Torrance, or any of the characters, right? Because Wendy herself has some interesting moments that, as a two-dimensional character who's just all bad. you're not really engaging with the work, because the work is asking you to consider that you yourself, the reader, are just as normal and just as regular as any of the members of this family, Jack, Wendy, or even the child, right? And you are asked whether or not the place creates the monster, or whether or not the characters bring the monsters that are inside themselves to the place, and the place pulls those particular monsters out. But what we see is somebody who is struggling against their own dislocation. And at a very critical point in the narrative, the good Jack wins out over the bad Jack. So I think ultimately one of the things that King might have been getting at on that kind of autobiographical basis is that the reality of parenting is that everybody deserves a gold star for not killing their children. And truly, as a mother of two, I really do feel that anybody who's gotten a child to the age of 5 and not like sold them or, you know, thrown them out the window, that's what parenting really comes down to. I mean, sort of fetishizing it as if we never ever have anything but rainbows and unicorns is doing a great disservice to like the amazing achievement that parenting is. So I think that's one of the things that King is getting into, and the idea that the hotel presents Jack with his worst demons in the form of alcoholism. You know, you could say it presents Wendy with the worst version of her demons, right? Which is a completely alienated killing machine of a spouse. It's an interesting speculation as to whether or not then the hotel presents the child with every child's worst nightmare, right? So yeah, that's where your observations lead me on the question about whether or not it's as simplistic as, oh, horrible to get into the mind of an abusive.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, well, I mean, the way our society talks about good and evil, it is it's kind of screwed up. But anyway, but Jack,
it's sort of simplistic. I think the reason why it's screwed up is because it's overly simplistic.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that that's generally the case in almost everything that you and I touch on. I think it seems to come back to this thing where, you know, you're going to find yourself making either bad investment choices or bad life choices or living in super psychotically divided societies if people think they just have to think once and that they have to think only in a binary way, and that they don't actually recognize that none of these things truth is not simple. Truth is not clean, right? The universe is quantum. It is a paradox. So to want and interact with your characters in novels or in politics or in the marketplace as if they were just two-dimensional binary things is part of the stuff that's creating the problem.
Well, yeah, so we can get to that when we talk about Nietzsche. But so Jack Torrance is a creative person, or at least he's trying to be, and he is an English teacher, and he wants to write a play. So he is trying to be creative, and that is something that I think everybody can identify with. And I think, yeah, I think it's really bold of Stephen King to use author characters quite often. I thought that was a little bit silly at first, but to me, like the idea of an author, that's kind of like a heroic person in our society. That's like somebody who has, you know, achieved a lot. So it's kind of a power fantasy, and also just kind of like just kind of like a hero character, like somebody that like not like a James Bond hero, but like a more of a hero that I would relate to, you know.
I think that's correct. I mean, my greatest heroes are authors. So I have to admit a bias. And if I have any personal ambition, it's to leave written things that are read after I go, right? So there is this very ancient idea of the power of the word, and the heroic act of making a form of communication that requires total solitude. I mean, one of the things that writing is that it's not speaking, right? And that it is an attempt to communicate widely while being engaged in something totally solitary. So here we have King presenting a character who is amplifying in it by choice and in the surroundings the solitude, kind of externalizing the solitude that is also internal when you sit to write something, and trying to force the creative act. And there is kind of a question when King talks about authors and what happens when they try to force the work, which is really a meditation on all artists or the creative process in general. Bad, scary ass stuff can happen if you amplify the things that are necessary to create and try to force creation. I think that's one of the things that comes through because the anti-creative, the destructive power of frustrated work is pretty well sketched out.
Yeah. So when Jack gets to the hotel, he is the caretaker over the winter. And when he gets to the hotel, the evil hotel tries to well, Danny has a special power called the Shining. That's the sun. The hotel wants to get to him, but it wants to get to him through Jack Torrance. And so it tempts Jack Torrance with his alcoholism and with his his hatred of the the head of the hotel. I don't remember, Stuart Ullman. Um,
Yeah.
he plays his emotions. It finds his weaknesses, and it plays those, and that's kind of how it takes down his defenses so that it can get into his mind.
It's an interesting, like, ancient archetypal idea, right? That children, Danny being a sort of archetypal child, right? That children have this special access to whether it's forces or powers or some form of being able to see reality, right? So, I mean, I think one of the things that struck me so strongly when I first started reading King's stuff was how, as you pointed out, you know, these kind of somewhat simplistic, kind of very easy to access narrative plots are actually ways of talking about really archetypal ideas. Because the idea that that the hotel is after Danny is kind of replicating an idea you come across over and over and over again, right? That the devil wants to get inside of the innocent child, or in Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End, right? The aliens have come for the children.
Oh my God. Okay, wait a minute. We have to discuss that book at some time too. No spoilers in this
No
episode.
spoilers, but it
But yeah, like I feel like, well, let's talk more about mythology if when we talk about it,
yes,
because
let's.
that book is like it is like a pagan ritual. Uh not to say too much, but
It's like the alternative classics course, right? I mean,
yeah.
we're in Civ through Stephen King's It. I think that would be a great way to get college students in your class.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I think that when people do, late 20th century literature, a few centuries from now, they will read it.
I think so. And just to put in a word here, if we chat about misery at all, I can also speak about this. But I have to say that as somebody who has spent some time teaching writing, I hold Stephen King up as an exemplar because his book on writing, which he wrote after he got seriously injured, is one of the best things I've ever read on the art and craft of writing. And my favorite Stephen King mantra is, if you find yourself using an adverb, stop, cross it out, and find a better verb. So, if you look at his language, it's even sentence by sentence, especially the earlier work where he was still being, forced to bring it in under 1,000 pages. It's remarkable. There's a great deal to be learned from him as a craftsman, just of the language.
Yeah, well, I would love to talk about Misery, but I'm actually only 2/3 of the way through, so don't tell me what happens. But Misery is fantastic. I love it a lot, and it is so funny. Like, it's hard for me to even see it as a horror novel because to me it is a a brilliant satire on being being an author. And
Yeah,
Misery is like
precisely.
the she is the audience character, and she has him trapped in her house. And
It's a fantastic meditation. It's fantastic meditation, I think, on being a creative person, on being a writer. And it's also, I mean, the thing that's great about King is that he explores the expression of rage in so many different subtle ways, right? I mean, I think that's also, you say it's hard to consider it as a horror novel. I felt the same way when I read The Shining. I was deeply disturbed and moved, right? But I didn't have that kind of fake blood horror experience.
yeah, exactly. I agree. Yeah. And like the monster parts of the book are so so silly that I really was laughing for a lot of them, where there's a part of the end where like the evil hotel like takes over Jack Torrance, and Danny is talking to them, and he goes like, "I'll make you take your medicine."
Right,
So
right.
stupid.
But on the other hand, like to be all like serious about it, I think the thing that's chilling is that somewhere in the depth of the brain, one knows that you can encounter real human beings like that, and we otherwise call it madness, or we call it degenerative Alzheimer's, or we call it, being possessed by the devil. I mean, I think that's the thing about King, as you pointed out at the beginning, right? The evil coffee cup. Well, yeah, that's the terrifying reality of life, is that the coffee cup sometimes is totally terrifying, right?
Oh, I have a funny story. Today or yesterday, I was at a fast food place, and when they called out my number and got it, there was this person standing there, and he said to me, "I knew that was going to be you that picked up that number." He said, "I have ESP," so I told him, "Me too."
Me too, and her also, but she just doesn't know it yet.
Right. Oh, that would have been great.
Totally,
So
totally.
anyway, back to
You gotta out crazy the crazies.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. No, that's good advice. Back to The Shining. So then so the fact that it is the evil hotel infecting Jack's mind, that allows you to sort of stay continue to identify with him even as he becomes the mass murderer, because you can say that's not really him, that's the hotel. I mean, even though obviously we've seen from the first part of the book that his alcoholism is very serious, and he's really not a good, he's someone who really shouldn't be a father.
Well, possibly also isn't somebody who should be up there super uber alienated and isolated, while trying to engage in something that's an isolating project in the first place.
Yeah. Oh, well, so let me talk a little bit about the character of Wendy now that you bring that up, because she is kind of like I really like how Stephen King does her, because she is like
Mhm.
she's crazy too, because she goes along with this. And she is like
Right,
it is almost like she is the victim, but it is almost impossible to identify with her. Like Jack Torrance is the character that you identify with. And
right, and I think one of the things that he's very effective in doing, King is very effective in doing, is showing, um, if we take Wendy as kind of representational of motherhood in conflict with wifehood, where the selfhood totally disappears, right? We don't get any inkling of Wendy as an individuated self until the very end of the book, after everything, right?
right, yeah.
Um, right, and so we see in the narrative that when presented with sort of a self-preservation with the child as secondary, as Danny is secondary, Danny is the one who says, "No, don't, we're not leaving," right? And so there you see Wendy functioning as a mother, um, privileging what are her child's desires, wants, needs, which just amplifies the fact that she kind of disappears as a character. As you say, it's hard to feel sympathetic. You end up feeling sort of frustrated, because she's not really making anything better, and she inadvertently seems to be making things worse.
Yeah, well, to me, like it's a depiction of a dysfunctional family, and Stephen King is showing us that she is part of the problem,
Yeah.
just in the same way that Jack Torrance is.
But I think he's
Because
also showing, I think he's showing something archetypal almost about um, suggesting that it's almost impossible that the tension between um, personhood and motherhood or womanhood and wifehood and motherhood, that these are almost unresolvable, right? That some version of that self is going to be sacrificed, and therein may lie the problem, right? Because there is some degree of resentment that Jack Torrance expresses with regards to Danny's even existence as taking away time, effort, focus on him. And that's a perennial problem. Again, that's one of the things that parents or the parental gestalt, refuses to talk about, is how much resentment and alienation baby can bring, right? As opposed to, again, just happiness and joy and more bonding.
yeah.
Right? And vice versa. I mean, it's not just from Jack to Wendy, but it's also kind of Wendy. Wendy has the other kind of competing thing, which is in the process of supporting Jack, she is supporting the process of his writing, which is something that is completely absorbing his time and attention. So worse than even a mistress, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that is kind of his motivation for becoming a murderer, is that his family is interfering with his creativity. And
Right, which he himself is undermining by embracing his own demons, e.g., alcoholism, and amplifying by taking himself and his family into this extreme version of isolation.
sure, but I think the point here is that you know, isn't that what every family does? I mean, if you that's kind of why that's kind of like to me that is like the horror of the novel is you
Right.
you you think about this. You think, doesn't every family, doesn't my family want to interfere with my creativity, regardless of where you are in the family, you
I
know
think you're
um
completely right. I think you're completely right. I think he's talking about like the cost of the creative persona or act. Okay. I think whether that's, family, society, whatever. The point is that you've almost got to kill something in order to create something. And that may be that what you're killing is a degree of connectedness. It may be that you're killing some degree of idea of sacrificing what is really a very self-centered and therefore potentially described as selfish act when somebody goes off and says, "Listen, I'm not interacting with you. I'm doing this thing. I'm creating over here." Plus, the idea, back to this idea that we would perhaps be all a lot healthier if we were able to tolerate being more honest about what civilization actually means. And civilization means not killing your family members, right? And that's an achievement, because all of the motivators to whether it's kill literally, kill metaphorically, kill levels of intimacy or obligation in order to create autonomous space. I mean, we don't really operate in a culture that is capable of being comfortable with talking about things that are difficult. So we kind of pretend that they don't exist or pathologize them, right? Back to your, I don't want to be in the mindset of an abusive guy. Well, wait,
exactly, yes.
there's a whole lot more complicated and interesting and therefore liberating stuff in here, right? In the sense of when we feel that others are experiencing something similar to what we experience, all of us get a sense of like, not alone, not abnormal, you know?
Yeah.
It's why the mummy mafia, who walk around talking about their children as if they've never had a frustrated moment and they just, love buying stuff for them, are not doing anybody's mental health any good.
The mummy mafia, that's funny.
Mummy mafia. That's them, right? They make the world go round. I wanted to return to something you said earlier about how the kind of narrative plot that King uses about the hotel is evil, and that allows us to maintain a kind of sympathy connection to Jack, because we can read the story in the context of it's the hotel that's haunted, it's the hotel that's evil. And I think one of the things that King might be asking us to consider, right, is aren't we all subject to doing that? Aren't we all subject to going to a certain place or a certain context and ascribing to the place our own potentially monstrous behavior? Like, it wasn't me that was absolutely horrible and rude. It was grandma's house and turkey being served in front of Uncle Joe that made me do it, right? You know,
Yeah,
I'm not
playing
an asshole.
the blame game.
You know, it's the evil airport and the lines of security that are, you know, turning me into an asshole. I'm not really an asshole. So it's an interesting question, right? And I think the reality is that all of us are more biochemically, psychically affected, neurologically affected by our surroundings and our perception of those surroundings than again our kind of general culture allows for being normal. We kind of call that illness and an anxiety disorder, and I think that does us no great service. And so, you know, yes, King has this character that is like off on the extreme ends, but he is kind of suggesting that all of us are affected by the energies of places, right? And that we're not disconnected. Again, back to the thing about forces. Can't wait to get to it. But yeah, it's an interesting, to me, it's always been an interesting idea, the extent to which people say my problems are the place, and then they move place.
Oh, okay, so I want to talk a little bit about hallucinations. And by the way, yeah, no, I agree with what you said. So that so I want to talk about how Stephen King uses hallucinations
Mm-hmm.
to to geez, I mean, it's hard for me to even say what I'm what I'm thinking, but it's kind of like to me, the mark of a really great author is you know how to use nonsense. Like to me, that is a very that is an advanced technique, is being able to
The
use
Jabberwocky,
nonsense.
right? The
Yes, yeah.
Jabberwocky got to be one of the best poems in English language.
And Stephen King knows how to use nonsense, and he uses nonsense in his book to show us when the character's mind is coming apart. Okay, so it is like and he doesn't show us what's really there. That's what is effective about it. So he does this in The Shining, and almost the entire book it is like this, because you don't know where the hallucinations end and begin, because we know that the entire town of Derry is mind controlled by the evil creature. So to me, Derry is kind of like a society, or it's like a family. It's some kind of group of people who are all sharing the same dysfunction. And
Communal, a communal myth.
yeah, and the monsters are all incredibly stupid in it. They're like movie monsters and an evil clown.
And yet still not able to break through the kind of group mind control, right? Like that's I think one of the things that's really interesting about using almost like cartoon like monsters, right?
Yeah, and the real monster, I think that this kind of shows that the real monster doesn't understand what these pictures are at all. Like we really get the sense of an alien intelligence, because it's just kind of like this picture scares children and this picture lures children. I don't know what it means. It just means that they use it to manipulate children, you know?
But it also suggests a kind of, as you say, alien, but a kind of active experimentation,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. So obviously wanting to learn and having somewhat crude tools for learning. And I think we see the same kind of thing happening in the hotel, trying to learn how to get to Danny and trying to learn how to get to and through Jack. I mean, I guess it is this sort of king-like observation on the nature of evil. I never really thought about it before, but I think that's kind of evil doesn't really intuitively know. It just knows that if it experiments enough, it will find your weak spot. It will find your thing. And that's a kind of interesting comparison to the idea of good, which is often, I think, always presented as sort of intuitive, right?
Yeah, so you need to well, to bring it back to investing, you need to figure out where your weak spots are. You need to probe yourself, find out how
and
you're
then
vulnerable.
right, and I've been thinking about this, and then take action. I mean,
Right.
it's much like look. I think about this with regards to envy. Okay, so it's right up there in the commandments. Obviously, humans have known for a long time that we have a weakness for envy, jealousy. It doesn't do us any good. It leads to covetousness. It's not a good thing. We've known this long time. Okay, so the next step then is instead of just yelling at yourself in the mirror, be a different person from don't be human. We should actually put in place things that minimize our stimulus towards envy. All
Sure.
right.
And well, to me the problem with envy is if you're worried about someone else, you're not worried enough about yourself. So
I
you
agree,
can
but
make
I also think
mistakes. You make
that
mistakes
we
because you're
are
trying to
almost
match the other person rather than just trying to see where you can go from here.
okay. So I think that's an absolutely true and legitimate point. I also think that we should be humble enough to recognize that we have sort of innate human characteristics, and if we as a species have a weakness tendency to compare, how about we all do ourselves the favor of this is my big argument in favor of less difference between rich and poor or greater forms of equality, right? It's not even that it's a good in and of itself, it's that it helps protect us from what are kind of inherent weaknesses. And in the context of investing, if one has an inherent weakness to sell in an investment framework, which is all about time, investing being about time, then you should lock your stuff away in a form that makes it really difficult to get to.
Yeah.
Right. So do not have the things that you have invested in, e.g., decided on the time frame of a magnitude of years. You should not keep them in a form where you can sell them like this. And so
Yeah, exactly.
so once you know what your weaknesses are, you have to then take actual steps to help yourself, not just rely on this kind of highly Americanized version of self-improvement, where if I just say it enough, I won't. And that's just bullshit, like actually, so if you know that you have this tendency, then don't waste time trying to be a different person and then beat yourself up because you're just do something about it. Also, I just end this point. I really wanted to say, because I know that I can say it to you. I'm really tired of hearing the phrase "don't invest more than you're willing to lose." I think that's BS. Don't play with more than you're willing to lose. But investing is not about losing, right? Investing is about security of return of investment, and then some framework of return to investment with a long time frame. And I don't think that people should think about it in terms of what you're willing to lose. Because if you go into it in that kind of framework, you're not likely to make sound decisions in the first place.
Well, that's a really good point. And like to me, like it's if it's it's always about the next best alternative. So if it's Bitcoin versus the dollar, I mean, I'm pretty sure if I keep dollars, I'll eventually lose those at some point too. So
Right. Right. And it's a question of time, right? And like this now moves into things that have to do with risk, and time. And then it has to do with being realistic about what your personal and projectable needs are now, a little bit from now, and quite a bit from now. So
Yeah,
when we,
exactly.
right? So when we consider the fact that most of us still live in a world where our bills are in dollars. Okay. And if there's a cost of changing things back and forth between dollars and Bitcoin or dollars and shares or dollars and gold or any of the metrics as you move them back and forth, I think it requires people to sort of think with different hats, which can be really difficult, and recognize that simply because you make an allowance for the fact that, for say, we live in a fiat world, that doesn't mean that you're somehow being disloyal to your deeper belief in the fact that the fiat world is going to collapse and such and such and such, right? I mean, people should not allow themselves to become trapped by their hopes and beliefs when it comes to making practical choices about today and tomorrow. You know, you're not practicing some kind of betrayal against yourself. You know, and as far as the fiat world, I mean, and I do want to do a video on this because it goes to some of the ways in which inflation, interest rates, credit, you know, they are as much imagined entities as money itself. They have now 400, 500, 600 years worth of continual sort of practice and use. And there's no question that the means of daily exchange has always benefited from being something that was not increasing in value, was hopefully stable, right? Or possibly decreasing. And that the trade-off has always been that risk-free rate of return. So until we really truly broke the system in 2009, 2010, 2009, you know, there was some degree of trade-off because yes, okay, you had a depreciating means of exchange, e.g. it was falling in value, but you could compensate because you could put it in the bank, you could give it to the Romans to look after in the temple.
Okay, now wait. Okay, let's go off on this topic some other
Right,
time.
I'm sorry, I kind
I
of
was
lost
let's make a Stephen King-esque novel about an evil currency,
accountant.
an evil abstract currency, like instead of a concrete coffee cup, we'll have an evil money. But anyway, so there's a part in Misery that I liked a lot where the writer is first learning about his captor, the giant crazy woman who I forgot her name, but there's a part where she's acting kind of normal, and then he makes her mad, and it says he saw a crevice, and I like that because it's kind of like a synesthesia. So he obviously she just made some like dumb expression that like some normal human wouldn't make, that looked very dark or something, but he was like imagining it as like a portal into the evil dimension.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about granite and stone and cracks in, you know, crevice is something I associate with stone, right? And that's an unusual feature. And yes, it leads to kind of druidy, kind of Merlin type dark places. Yeah, for sure. Um, she she is an interesting meditation and crazy lady. That's for sure.
So one last thing that I had, I'm also reading Salem's Lot. This is just like me to read two Stephen King books at the same time, but there's a part in there. I don't think that this one is as great as the other ones we talked about, but there was a part that I really liked where the vampire kind of shows up, and he's not doing anything terrible, but he's just kind of acting a little suspicious, and the guy's like, "What are you doing here? The lot is closed now," and he just kind of, the vampire just kind of like tries to chew the fat with him, and this man, his thoughts just kind of trail off, and he starts thinking about the dumb events of his day, and he is vaguely aware that he is being uh, hypnotized, but the emotional connection has been lost, so he cannot get get aroused to act, even though the awareness is there, and he just starts thinking about random stuff. So that's just like what you were talking about earlier, because he can't act to deal with the problem, and then we don't know what the vampire does because he just starts he starts just tripping, kind of like he's on LSD or something.
It's interesting because as you describe it, it makes me think about what the experience is as a reader, right? I mean, you are hopefully being hypnotized.
Yeah, well,
And
you were the reader. You know that the vampire is there and that something is happening, and you want to look at it, and Stephen King won't let you look at it.
yeah, right, exactly. And I am now in charge, says Stephen King. And if I'm going to subject you to some really crazy ass hallucinations, strap in because there's no way out, right? And if I'm going to subject you to kind of really boring quotidian details, you're also trapped right there too. But I want to say thank you for the focus on the hallucination part of these works, right? Because it's something that I hadn't really thought about that much before. I guess because it's not obvious, but hallucinations to me have always been a very interesting meditation on whether or not the world that we see and take as real is a hallucination itself, right? So I hadn't really thought about how well those things work as a way of trying to signal that the characters are going crazy. But underneath that, there's a deeper question about, and you reader, are you sane?
Yeah.
No?
So we will let's get back to that when we talk about Francois Rabelais at some point. But as to authors who who know about hallucinations,
Absolutely.
he's another one. But to me, yeah. Well, like I really like how Stephen King can kind of use sort of a stream of consciousness style that is like it's almost like To the Lighthouse or like William Faulkner or something, but he
Mhm.
doesn't make an incredibly boring novel with that. He makes, something exciting, and then he uses the stream of consciousness for purposes in the story.
But I think that's one of the reasons why, if I were going to teach, some kind of college class on writing, I would say, listen, let's really consider Stephen King as the superior technical writer to Woolf or Faulkner, because he is actually making the stream of consciousness comprehensible, right? And I think in some ways, I love Faulkner, I love Woolf, but there is a degree, and Rabelais is getting at this kind of pretentiousness of the intellectuals, right?
Yes.
That you need to make it so difficult and obscure, what, in order to validate that it's art or that it's high quality IQ work, whereas King is over there making the stream of consciousness actually comprehensible to the reader. And I think as I say, I think there's a case for saying that's actually technically more difficult. To be clear is more difficult than to be obscure. To be obscure might be kind of interesting and symbolic and support PhD programs, on what the hell it is that Faulkner's saying. But in King's case, he is really, I think, like Twain and Dickens, as you say, like really invested in trying to get as many readers as possible to engage with what can be presented as very difficult stuff, but doesn't have to be.
I have a quote here from James Joyce. I put so many enigmas and puzzles that it will keep the professors busy for centuries arguing over what I meant, and that's the only way of ensuring one's immortality. So, yeah, sorry, James Joyce. I think that you haven't figured out the only way of ensuring your immortality.
We may even get brave enough to get to Joyce, right? But that's
Yeah.
a brilliant quote. That's exactly it right there.
Well, I was gonna introduce the episode on Rabelais with that, so I'll still do that when we get to Rabelais. But that is like because Rabelais is like the opposite of that. It is like everything is meaningless.
Right, right. And what's interesting about Rabelais and Don Quixote and I think I mentioned Montaigne, like they're all writing at precisely the time where this modern version of pretentiousness of intellectual achievement through obscurity is actually coming into existence. You know, you've had the printing press for a little while. You've had enough Greco-Roman authors translated. You've had enough sort of written as serious imitation, and suddenly there is a whole new class of sort of technocrat, bureaucrat, intellectuals who are all running around precisely doing this. That you get into that esoteric thing where if you don't understand all of my obscure references, you know, you couldn't possibly be part of the tribe. Rabelais and Don Quixote totally take the piss out of this newly emerging group of people, you know, who are still with us.
I didn't get to talk about it nearly as much as I was hoping to, but I don't know. I think we got Stephen King good enough. So for the audience, go read it and figure it out yourself. It's fantastic. And I don't have anything else. Do you have any final thoughts?
Only just to suggest read Stephen King. Even if you're not at all taken by the plot and so on and so forth, he is one of America's greatest technical stylists. So he's worth that, even if you can't get hooked. And I defy anybody to not get hooked.
Okay, well, great talking to you. See you later.
As always, see you later.